Hi, this is the third in a series of videos where we're making this scene. Today we're going to add the grass and the kelp. If you've missed the earlier videos, check the description. Let's get going. So this is what it looked like at the end of the last video. We had some basic texturing in, some rocks, some hard corals. What we're going to do now is we're going to add in all of the soft corals. And this looks like a pretty scary graph, but it isn't, trust me. Mostly it's just this top graph here repeated multiple times down as we go. So let's take a deep look at one of these. So we start off with a Voronoi pattern, which gives us some blocks of strong areas. We'll see that in action in a moment. We have this blend node as well, which the Voronoi is going into, and the background for the blend node is coming in down here. It's basically the texture for the coral, and we're putting that through a contrast so that we can get the same kind of effect that we're seeing in the shader here, which is either coral or sand. So let's go back and see how that's plugged in, and then we'll be able to see the effects of that on the graph. So we'll create a new function inside of our corals group here, and we'll drag our soft corals graph, which I've already created, we're going to go through that now, into here. Now you'll see it's quite different from the previous hard coral. We have all these parameters and inputs. We'll talk about those as we go, but for now let's just wire up the soft coral texture, and then we can go over to the graph. And here now we can see in the preview that we have the contrast coming in, which is going to go over into our blend node and be blended in with our Voronoi, which looks different now, and that's because we have those parameters going in. Again, we'll come back to those in a minute. So next up we have our scatter. That's the same as we were doing last time. It gives us random places to put things. We're going to mask that out using our blend node. Now at the moment we don't have many of those scatter objects coming through, and that's because our mask is so strong, and we can change that using these variables. So if we zoom in a bit, we can see we have this variable called intensity. Let's just up that to 100. So we're going to increase the intensity from 1 to 100. That's just a variable. Don't worry about the others for now. Let's go back to the graph, and we can see that now we're seeing a lot more of these coming through the mask, and in fact our Voronoi is mostly green, whereas before it was mostly red. How does that happen? So let's go back to the main graph again, and let's just reduce that down to 10 now. If I go back to the graph here, we can see that we have this patchy area, and the reason is we've exposed this variable called intensity inside of this node. And so we can expose that same variable in different places, so it's down here as well, you see. Now we can have as many of these variables as we want. So for example, this coral is the bulbous coral, and if we go in here we can see we've defined a variable called density of bulbous. So how do you go about defining these? Well, it's dead simple. Let's say we want to increase the cell size of the bulbous mask here. So we go into the variable, we right click, we select expose, and then we give it the name, so cell size bulbous. The first time you type this in, it won't actually have an existence in the graph, so you have to click this assign button here, and that will give it the default value that you had in that cell to start with. But it'll be available to be reused elsewhere at this point. So if we go up to the main, we can now see we have cell size bulbous, and we can make that much larger, go back to the actual graph, and we can see the cell size has increased. Great stuff. I'm actually going to remove that though. There is a performance overhead in using these, so only use them if you really need them. So the rest of this part of the graph is just like we were doing in the last episode. We're using a rarify to make sure that these don't come too close together. Then we're using a spread to create small groups of them. And we're using an adjust to give them some rotation and so on. And then finally an object spawner to create the individual corals. And we just repeat the same pattern across each of the individual soft corals. And here you can see the result. Now we can go into this and we can play with those densities to get a different balance between the different types of corals. But there's a few other things that we want to do as well. For example, here we have this problem where this Coral 5 variant is appearing in the same spot as this other coral, which is a large soft coral. So what we need to do is we need to prevent them coming into the same place. And I've done this on most of the items, but I thought it'd be useful to see exactly how I do it because it's quite different from what we did in some other episodes. So this here is the large soft coral where that's spawning, and down here we have the variant. And so what we want to do is stop the variant appearing where there is a large soft coral. Now if we go up here, we can see that when we rarefy, we're actually taking out this value here into an exit portal. We can use that to exclude the other corals from spawning those areas. So we're going to put in an exit portal here, and we're going to select that same value, and then we're just going to connect it in over here to this rarefy node. So we'll just add an extra layer in there, connect it up, and then we're going to say that we shouldn't spawn within 4 meters of any of the items coming from that layer. And once we drag across our window, we can see that that's had the effect we want. So that gives us our corals, but the sandy areas here are really bland right now. So let's add some grasses in. I already have a graph for the grass, and here it is. It's not a particularly complicated one. There's a couple of things in here that are new, so we'll go over those, but for the most part this should be fairly obvious to you if you've been following this series. So let's go back to our main and add in a function node like we normally do, drag in our grass into that. And this has 2 inputs. It has the grass textures, or rather the sand texture, and it has the height map. So first of all we need an exit portal, and that is going to have the sand textures, which we haven't set up yet. So let's go and do that. Go up to our height maps up here, and the bottom one is our sand textures. So we'll create an enter portal and connect our sand textures up to that, giving it an appropriate name. So back to our function, and we can now select our sand texture and wire that up to the appropriate input. We're also going to want our height map here, so we're going to create a new exit portal, select the height map and connect that up too. And straight away you can see we have some grasses visible in our scene view over here. So let's click through onto our graph and have a look at how that's happening. So this is coming through on this bottom half of the graph here. Let's just close down these visualizations and go over to the right. We can see our object here is this short seagrass. If we take a look at the prefab, we can see that it's just one strand of this particular grass. So how are we getting these clumps? Well, if we take a look in here, if we go in close enough, we can actually see the other grass, but we're going to come back to that in a minute. So let's just move back a little. Let's have a look at this. We can see that these are appearing in specific areas of the terrain. So how are we finding those? Well, it's very similar to what we did with the rocks in the previous video. We have this cavity node here, and if I turn on the preview there, you'll be able to see how that cavity node is picking up from the height map and is finding the dips in the terrain, and then we're using those dips to place this seagrass. So we can see that here, if we increase the intensity, we'll get more areas being selected and therefore more seagrass. So let's just reduce that back down again. And we're also using the sand texture, which is coming into this contrast node just as we were doing before. We're trying to make sure that we match the kind of on or off contrast of the stylized shader here. And as we expand this out and visualize it, we realize that we've got a bit of an error here. We have our sand texture is covering the whole of the terrain. Now, this is because we've actually taken the value of the sand texture from the wrong place. Let's go back to the main and I'll show you what I mean. So what we've done is we've taken our sand texture from the base texture here, but afterwards we've added in our rocks and our coral textures above it. So some areas are being overwritten, and that's resulting in grass being put onto our coral area, for example, like we see on the left. So let's just disconnect this. I'm actually, while I'm here, going to create an entry portal for the rocks as well. That's for something later on. It's always good to have these entry portals available. Okay, and so now we can create a blend node, and what we're going to do is we're going to use the sand texture as the base of the blend node, or the background of the blend node. Then we're going to subtract the rocks and the corals from that base or that background, and we'll put that into our entry node for the sand textures. So what that's going to do therefore is remove those other areas of texturing that we've applied over the top of the sand. That will result, as you can see, in there being no grass on the coral areas. Okay, so how do we get the grass into our graph? Well, first of all, let's see what it looks like. It's a bit short at the moment, so we'll go into our Map Magic object and we will increase the details distance to, let's say, 800. Okay, now we have grass going much further into the distance and we can see what it looks like. There's these patchy areas. How are we achieving that? Let's take a look at the graph. And this is the same graph as we were using for the tall grass, or the short grass as it's called, even though it's tall. We're using the same Voronoi and we're using the same sand textures. We're blending them together just like before, multiplying, so we're only getting them where the Voronoi and the sand exists. And then we're using a selector to separate those out into values that are under a half and over a half. And each of those becomes different grasses. And so we end up with what we see here. That's great, but it's still looking a little bare here, and in this pack there are things called kelp, and so we're going to put patches of kelp in all over the place. So to do this, let's open up our main. We'll create a new function because we have a graph to do this. We'll drag that graph in, which is our kelp graph here, and that takes a single input, which is the sand textures, and we already have that in a portal, so we'll just get the exit portal and wire these sand textures in. If we take a look now at the actual scene, we'll see that we now have kelp in there. And there's a patch just there. So how does that actually work? Well, let's take a look at this kelp graph. And at the beginning, we're doing the same thing as usual. We're taking the sand textures and using the contrast node to go from 0 to 1. But then we're adding a blur. And what the blur does is it kind of rolls off between the two values. And if I bring the camera up here, you'll be able to see what that does. At the center, it's very tightly, densely clumped together. And as you move out towards the edges, it becomes rarer and rarer. And that's achieved by taking this blur node and putting it into the mask for the scatter. And that will filter out a number of those items. And then we just use a split and a spread and an object node, or in this case rather a trees node. Now if you don't know what they are, how they work, then you want to look at some of the earlier videos. We've covered each of those nodes before, with the exception of the tree node, which is used to place a terrain tree into the scene. So these are not being placed as objects, they're being placed as terrain trees. And there you have it. Simple as that. A nice big clump of kelp to break up the sight lines. Now that looks great, but I want to be able to see them further in the distance. So we'll drop into our Map Magic object, find our tree detail distance and increase that. Now you have to be careful with these tree distance and detail distance because obviously they're going to hit performance. But as you can see, we're seeing way more in the picture here now. But it's still not enough, so I'm going to increase the density on that scatter node. Let's take it up to 15,000. Wow, that's a lot. That's probably way too much. You'll probably get a really big performance hit there. So let's bring it down to, let's say, 1500. That's better, that's more manageable. So something between those two would be ideal. And if you were running runtime, of course, you could change this depending on the hardware available to the machine. Have a more lush environment on the more powerful machines. And that's it for this one. One more video, possibly two, we'll see, and we'll end up with something looking like this. It's much more about the polishing now and the adding of the extra little detail like the fish and the sharks and the rocks and things like that. See you soon.